If you want to learn how to make stars in Nebula and Hitfilm, then you're in luck, because that's what we're talking about today. The first Hitfilm tutorial I ever watched was how to create a 3D space nebula by Simon Jones on the Hitfilm official YouTube page. And this is the very first shot that I ever created in Hitfilm. I'm Mike Miller from Tri-M Visual, and today we're going to look at how to create starfields and 3D space nebula in Hitfilm. And here we are in Hitfilm Express 2017. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We'll go ahead and leave that at 1920 by 1080 and 24 frames per second. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Start Compositing. Come down to the Settings cog and rename this Fractal Starfield. And I'm going to come to the New Layer button, create a new plane, which I'm going to rename Black Plane 1920 by 1080. Click OK. Come to the Effects panel. Grab a Fractal Noise, drop that on our black plane, move over to the Layer Controls, open up the Fractal Noise, and in the Preset drop-down, we're going to select Starfield. Now, this is the easiest way to create a starfield plate in Hitfilm 2017. But if we come over to the Viewer window and start zooming in a little bit and scroll around, we can see that the star field produced by the Fractal Noise preset isn't quite little pinpricks of light, it's little blobs of light. A couple of episodes ago when we built our galaxy plate, the blobs looked good, representing further galaxies around our main galaxy, but usually for a star field, you're going to want your points to be a little bit smaller. So let's dig into the settings of this Fractal Noise star field and see what we can do to make it look a little bit sharper. The algorithm type used in this preset is the clouds algorithm. This is fine, nothing wrong with that, we'll let that go. But down here in the scale, we see the scale has been set to 7.5 pixels. We can probably get a sharper star field by taking this down from 7.5 to, say, 3. And immediately we're getting a lot sharper image. Yes, we can still see here this blob, but my viewer is currently set to 370%. So if we back that out to 100, this star field has become a lot sharper. Let me reset that to 7.5. Another way to increase the sharpness of this star field is to open up the axis scale and change the X and Y values from 100% to something lower, say 50. And once again, if we start zooming in, still a little bit blobby, but again, we're back at 370% magnification. Once we go back to 100, this looks nice and sharp. Let me reset that back to 100. Let's take a look at the subsettings menu and see if anything here makes this star field sharper. The subsettings is a second fractal algorithm underneath the main one that's used to add complexity. The default setting for sublevels is at 10. Taking this up to a higher number uses more sublevels in the fractal, but takes longer to calculate. Turning this up to 20 isn't making a difference. Turning this down to 0, you can see how the sublevels add complexity. As I play with this slider, I see that a sublevel setting above 2 has no apparent effect on the star field. This means I can turn the sublevels down to 2 or 3 because higher levels aren't making a difference in the star field, but it does slow down the rendering. Changing the sublevels from 10 to 2 or 3 isn't going to increase the sharpness of this star field, but it will make it faster for Hitfilm to calculate. The influence slider determines how much of the sublevels carry through to the main fractal algorithm. Playing with this slider does make a difference. Things up above 70 or so start bringing too much of the sublevels, and things below 40 or so take out too much of the sublevels, but moving from the default of 50 to about 70 does make this look a little bit sharper. Set that back to 100%. The subsetting scale slider affects the scale of the subsettings. Once again, we can adjust this Extreme values make the star field blobbier, but moving a little bit off that 50 position seems to make a difference. Taking that to around 60 seems to work nicely. Finally, these appearance controls. The exposure and offset settings determine the balance of the two colors used in the fractal noise. If we take the exposure up from 6.6 to a little bit higher, that should be increasing the contrast a little bit. Let's see if I zoom in more again. So increasing the exposure setting slightly does sharpen this up a little bit, but it's not really making that much of a difference. Let's see what happens if we take this offset slider. If we raise the value of that, that's exactly what we don't want. That's changing the offset of the black and white values and bringing in larger blobs of white. We're aiming for smaller blobs of white, so let's take this a little bit smaller than the 0.76 in the preset. Let's make that negative 0.85. Too much. That's wiped out all of our stars. Negative 0.8. Taking the offset slider down really just seems to be dimming out the stars without making them any sharper. So in adjusting the fractal noise settings, I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to the stock star field. So in adjusting the fractal noise settings, the ones that seem to be the most effective for getting smaller, sharper stars are the scale or the axis scale. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and set the axis scale back down to 3. And I'm going to zoom the viewer back to 400%. What other effects can we add to this to sharpen this up a bit? Well, there are two. I'm going to grab Crush Blacks and Whites and drag that after the fractal noise. The Crush Blacks and Whites filter simply eliminates mid-gray values by forcing values outside the threshold sliders to pure black or pure white. If I grab this black slider and start bringing that up a bit, you can see where some of these dimmer stars are starting to go away. They're being pushed completely into black. If I bring the white slider down a bit, see how some of those dimmer stars are starting to brighten up. While some of our stars are still a little blobby, we are looking at this at 400% magnification. When we take this back up to 100, we've got a nice, sharp star field. I'm going to turn off the Crush Blacks and Whites for a moment and grab the threshold effect. And I'm going to drag that in between the fractal noise and the Crush Blacks and Whites. I'll also close the fractal noise settings. We don't need to see them. Threshold is similar to Crush Blacks and Whites. What threshold does is crush the entire image down to one of two solid colors based on a threshold setting. Any color value underneath that in the threshold setting will be shifted to the color 2 value. Anything above the threshold setting will be shifted to the color 1 value. In this case, harsh black and harsh white is fine. Turning the threshold slider down gives us a denser and brighter star field. All of the gray stars in the fractal noise are being shifted up to pure white. Raising the threshold slider will give us a much sparser star field, again, because only values equal to or above this color are remaining white while everything else is shifting to black. A little bit of adjustment to the fractal noise settings in the starfield preset with a combination of threshold or Crush Blacks and Whites can really tune your star field to be nice and sharp. All right, let's take a look at another way to generate star fields. I'm going to create a new composite shot. I'm going to call this Noise Star Field, leave it at 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, 30 seconds long. And I'm going to drag in another copy of my black plane. This time from the effects panel, we're going to grab Noise, and I'm going to zoom back in on the viewer window, right back up to 400%. The noise filter generates a random noise grunge pattern. The controls on this are the amount, how much noise you want from 0 to 100. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn that right up to 90 for now. The next control is the Monochrome checkbox. The default generates a colored noise pattern. We're looking for stars, so let's go ahead and click that Monochrome. That makes everything grayscale. And the seed is just a random seed, so changing the seed changes the noise pattern. Let me zoom this back out to 100%. Well, that's way too much noise. But to clean this up, we can use the same effects we used on the fractal noise to clean that up. So we'll take a look and dragging back in Crush Blacks and Whites by pulling the white down on that a bit, pushing the black up quite a lot. we can generate an attractive star field. When we zoom in on this one to 400%, we see it's a little bit less blobby than the fractal noise. Our stars are a little bit more defined. I'm going to go ahead and turn Crush Blacks and White off again. And let me drag Threshold in here instead. Same thing with Threshold. It's just adjusting the fader until you get the look you want. One thing about generating stars with the noise effect is a random generator that recalculates on every frame. So as I step forward in the timeline, we can see this star field is boiling. So for noise-generated star fields, we need to add one more effect to this stack to lock it down. We'll just go into the temporal group, grab the speed effect, and drop that in. The speed effect in Hitfilm is a little strange and a little bit counterintuitive and really requires its own episode to explain correctly. But for what we're doing, we don't need to worry about the idiosyncrasies of speed. We're just going to take this speed value of 1.0 and change that to 0. Changing the speed value to 0 is telling the speed effect to lock this frame that we've generated. So now as we move forward through the timeline, our star field stays exactly the same. Adjusting the noise amount and either the Crush Blacks and Whites or Threshold effect can very quickly generate a star field plane using noise. For our next method of generating stars, I've shifted into Hitfilm Pro 2017, and I'm creating a composite shot that is 1920 by 1080 frames per second, and I'm calling it Atomic Stars. I'm going to go ahead and create a new black plane, which will be used as a black background. For this one, I'm going to create a new white plane, which I've called White Plane 1920 by 1080. If you have Hitfilm Pro, or if you have the audio-visual add-on pack for Hitfilm Express, then you will have the atomic particles effect. And if we grab the atomic particles and drag that onto the white plane and move over to the layer controls, twirl open the disperse settings, and crank that all the way up, then it's going to start spreading these dots out across the star field. This is way too many, so we'll probably want to go ahead and go into particle placement and turn down the number of particles. The default is 500 by 500, but if I take this down to 100 by 100, we've already got more or less a complete star field. If we open up the particle appearance and take the size down from 5 to maybe 3, and maybe adjust the size random a bit, we've already got a pretty good star field immediately. If we zoom in on the viewer a bit, see that we have a pretty good shape, size, and distribution to those stars. You can always use Crush Blacks and White or Threshold to adjust this star field if you're not liking the look of it. Zooming in on this star in particular, we can see that we have a very large circle here. Let's try something to smooth that out a bit. I'm going to create another composite shot, call it Star Shape, and I'm just going to go ahead and make this 50 by 50. I'm going to create a new white plane, and I'm just going to grab an elliptical mask, center that mask up, and feather it. Maybe shrink that down. Return to the Atomic Stars composite shot, and drag in the Star Shape composite, drag that to the bottom underneath the black plane. If I return to the Atomic Particles effect, I can come over to the Particle Appearance tab and change the shape from Sphere to Layer, and then select the Star Shape Layer. Immediately, that softens up the white dot that was in the middle of the screen because we've replaced it with a more blurred shape. Let me scale to fit, take that back to 100%. We still have a good star field here, just now the shapes of the individual stars are a little bit less harsh. Something else we can do with our atomic stars, I'm going to create a point. I'm going to rename it to Stars Point, and I'm going to convert it to 3D, which creates a new camera. I'm going to come back to the Atomic Particles layer and add in a threshold effect after the atomic particles to brighten this up a bit more, and then I'm going to zoom in to 200%. I'm going to increase the size of the particles from 3 to 6. Now, if I zoom back out to 100%, this isn't really what I want, but I want these stars to be a little bit larger and a little bit brighter to make it more easy to see what's happening here. By changing the transform from to the star's point, moving the point around moves the star fields. And as I move the star field, you can see that we do have parallaxing going on, where some stars are closer to the camera and other stars are farther away. We can also move the stars toward or away from the camera. Using the atomic particles to create a star field is one of the fastest, easiest ways to create a 3D star field in Hitfilm, with the primary limitation being that you are limited in the size of your star field by the size of your atomic particle layer. I've changed the camera position to 20,000 pixels out, and I've really increased the size of the particles in the atomic particles effect. This is just to demonstrate that you can create a three-dimensional parallaxing star field in atomic particles really quickly, but you will have limits on your camera movement and your camera placement because there is a finite size to this star field. If I change the camera position from 20,000 to a mere -5,000, we don't really have any stars in our view anymore, although if we rotate the camera around, there they are. Another method for making star fields available to Express owners who have the Sci-Fi Adventures pack, or to Hitfilm Pro owners, is the hyperdrive effect. Just drag the hyperdrive effect in, twirl its controls open, and set its progress to 0.1. Instant star field. You can change the pattern of the stars by changing the seed parameter. You can change the size of the stars by changing the size parameter. And you can change the color of the stars by changing the temperature and temperature variation parameters, as well as the number of stars. The hyperdrive effect is one of the easiest ways of generating star plates in Hitfilm. This next method of creating stars is going to be for Hitfilm Pro users only. I'm going to create another composite shot, come up to the effects panel, and drag in the particle simulator. I'm going to skip ahead to frame 3 for the moment, and to make stars in the particle simulator, we need to make a few adjustments. We're going to open up the emitter and change the shape of the emitter from a point to a sphere. We're going to open up the particle systems, open up the particle system, open up the movement parameter, and we're going to change the speed from 200 to 0, and the life from 1 second all the way up to 60 seconds. We're going to open up the general settings for the particle system and activate keyframing for the active parameter. I'm going to turn active off, then I'm going to step back from frame 3 to frame 2 and turn active back on. This sets up our particle simulator so that all of our particles will spawn within 2 frames, that our particles will be stationary, and that our particles will last for a minute. We've set the emitter to a sphere. Now we're going to change the radius from 50 pixels to something much larger, 50,000. I'm also going to come back up to the media panel, grab my trusty black plane and put that beneath that particle simulator to have a black background rather than the transparency checkerboard. Now we'll return to the particle simulator, and I'm just going to go ahead and take particles per second up to 50,000. Now you can see, similar to the atomic particles, that we have a star field with closer stars and farther stars. And if I do what I did in the atomic particles variant and create a point, make it 3D, move into the particle simulator, and attach the emitter to the star's point layer, then by adjusting the position of the star's point layer, I can adjust the position of the stars and where they spawn. This is giving me a 3D star field similar to that of the atomic particles. However, by changing the size of the sphere emitter, I can control the size of my star field. In the atomic stars didn't exist more than 5,000 or so units past center. In this case, with the radius being 50,000, I know my star field is 100,000 units across. Very large, allowing me to do large camera movements. I have the same thing with the atomic particles, where the default texture shape is very large and very harsh. But just like the atomic particles, I can use that same star shape that I already created. And in particle appearance, I can change the texture source to layer and use the same star shape we used in the atomic particles. That smooths things out quite a lot. This particle simulator method is creating a very large, fully 3D star field, and my camera can pan, tilt, and zoom 360 degrees, and there are stars in every direction. If I return to the atomic stars comp and reset my camera, then start rotating the camera, can see that I do not actually have a full 360-degree panorama of stars. The atomic particle star field is a lot smaller than that generated by the particle simulator. Another trick we can do with our particle stars is to come up to the emitter controls and under shape, look for this control that says boundary and check that. Checking the boundary is forcing all of the stars to spawn at the surface of our sphere, not inside the sphere. What this has done is place all of our stars at a distance of 50,000 points from the center. I still have a full 360-degree star field I can view. They're just all off in the distance. Let me increase the scale so we can see our stars better. I'll spin that around again. We'll jump back into Hitfilm Express for the rest of this tutorial. So far, we've looked at 5 different ways of making starfield plates in Hitfilm: noise, fractal noise, atomic particles, hyperspace, and the particle simulator. Using atomic particles and using the particle simulator generates 3-dimensional star fields. But if you're in Express and don't have the AV add-on pack with atomic particles, or don't have the particle simulator available to you, how can we make 3D star fields in Express? Well, it's pretty simple. We're in our fractal starfield composite shot. I've got the viewer scale set at 100%. I'm going to go ahead and drag in another copy of the black plane and drop that on the bottom. I'm going to rename that background, and I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a 2D plane. I'm going to come up to this top plane. This is the one that has our stars on it, and I'm going to rename that Stars 1. Then I'm going to come up to the layer properties for the Stars 1 layer and change this from normal to add. Then I'm going to change the Stars 1 layer from 2D to 3D and create a camera. Then I'm going to make 3 duplicates of Stars 1 by hitting the Control D key. I'm going to rename these other planes Stars 2, 3, and 4. And then I'm going to move into Stars 2, 3, and 4, and I'm just going to change the seed in the Fractal Noise effect. I'm also going to change my viewer scale back to scale to fit. I'm going to come into the transform controls for Stars 2. I'm going to move the position from 0 to, say, -5,000. And then I'm going to scale this layer up to fill the screen. Come to Stars 3. I'm going to change its position from 0 to -10,000. Scale that up to fill the screen. Move to Stars 4's transform controls. Change its position to -15,000. And again, scale that up to fill the screen. Take the viewer scale back up to 100% just to see that a little bit better. Open up my camera controls, and now you can see if I change the position of the camera, that I now have parallaxing movement on my stars. The same procedure, changing the layers to 3D, moving them back in 3D space a bit, and scaling them up to fill the screen, will work with both fractal star fields and noise star fields. We're creating a 3D star field by placing our star fields out in 3D space. I'm going to right-click on this camera and reset that, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off Stars 1, 3, and 4 for now. And I'm going to make another duplicate of Stars 2. And I'm going to call this new duplicate Stars 2 Flares. I'm going to come into my Fractal Noise, into the transform settings, and I'm going to take the scale up from 3 to... Oh, I'm going to turn off Stars 2. I just want to keep this Stars 2 Flares visible. And let me change that viewer to scale to fit. I'm going to take the scale up from 3 to something larger, maybe 60. And I'm going to adjust the seed again until I have a few more stars in my frame. I'm going to move up to the effects panel, and I'm going to search for the auto light flares effect. And I'm going to drag that in after the crushed blacks and whites. I'm going to close the fractal noise and open up the hotspot generation for the auto light flares. I'm going to turn the threshold down, and I'm going to turn the number of flares up. And then I'm going to start playing around with the flare types. And I think I'm going to grab the spiked star effect, change the blend from screen to add. I'm going to turn back on the stars 2 layer, stars 1, 3, and 4. Basically, by duplicating the stars 2 fractal layer, increasing the scale of the fractal layer, we've created fewer stars, but larger stars. By placing the auto light flares on top of this, we've got a few flaring stars out in the distance. Now I can adjust the fractal noise and the size parameters until I get something that blends a little bit better with my existing star field. I'm going to go ahead and make another duplicate of the stars 4 plane and call that stars 4 flares. I'm going to follow the same steps in the star 4 flares plane. I'm going to return to the fractal noise, change the seed again, turn up the scale, add the auto lens flare effect, change that back to spiked star, and adjust the threshold and max flare settings. And I'm going to adjust the seed on the fractal noise again. Once again, giving me a 3D parallaxing star field with some larger, brighter flaring stars for some variation. And now after adding a couple position keyframes to our camera, we now have a 3D parallaxing star field. Looking here as we pass the star field plane, we can see that some of the stars are getting awfully large as we get closer with them to the camera. A simple way to fix this would be to go to the stars 1 plane, maybe grab the freehand mask, and just kind of maybe grab a little mask there, masking out the center section, and then inverting that mask. This eliminates the stars from the very center of the layer. I might even go ahead and copy that mask and paste it into stars 2 and stars 2 flare. Now when we play that back, that's just a little smoother as we pass through those 2 planes. Kind of like how we're hitting a flare artifact right at the end of this camera move. It's a big blue square! All right, let's get into some 3D space nebulas. And one way to do that is simply to come to Google and search for Nebula. Shift to the Images tab, open up the Tools settings, and let's make sure we do grab something that's labeled for reuse. And while we're at it, we'll come over to the Size tab and make certain we grab something larger than, let's grab something larger than 2272 by 1704. Okay, this narrows us down to large nebula images that we are allowed to use. I think I'm going to grab that one and save that image. Grab it and move it to the correct folder, and go ahead and drag this right into Hitfilm Express. I'm going to go ahead and create a new composite shot for this, and call this Nebula Parallax. Drag in a copy of the nebula image, and I'm going to use the scale parameters to scale this down to where it fills our frame. I'm going to go ahead and rename this layer Nebula 1, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it and turn off the top duplicate. So to get some 3D parallaxing out of this nebula, this is pretty simple. We're just going to go ahead and grab the freehand masking tool and mask out the sections of the nebula that we want to keep. Feather that a bit. Maybe add another mask. change this second mask to subtract and create another mask. Also change that to subtract. And I think I'll go ahead and do that to this bit as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and feather out all three of these subtracted masks. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this bottom nebula layer, turn back on this top nebula layer, rename that Nebula 2. I'm going to make another duplicate of Nebula 2, I'm going to turn off the top version, and I'm going to start masking out areas of the Nebula 2 layer that I want to keep. I'm going to turn that first mask off for a moment, add a second mask, and pick another area of this layer that I want to keep. Feather these out. Come up to my top layer, name that Nebula 3. I'm going to duplicate this one more time. Yes, there will be a Nebula 4. Sorry, this last mask is on our Nebula 4 layer. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these layers and convert them to 3D. Turn off the top 3 layers, and then it's doing just what we did to make our parallax star layer. We're just going to push these layers back in space and scale them up to fill. All right, I've done a few steps while screen recording was paused, and I'm just going to go ahead and talk through them. In the Nebula 2 layer, I unlocked the scale and changed the X scale to -192. This flips Nebula 2 on the X axis. And if I hold down Control and click on that, well, first you get to see a neat little shortcut. If you hold down Control and click on a scale or position parameter, it will invert it. And at 192, it's oriented the same way as the other layers. By flipping that, I get a slightly different look. My Nebula 3 layer, I've inverted the Y scale. And now that I look at it, I think I'm going to go ahead and position that in a different place, just to break that up a bit. And the Nebula 4 layer, while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to rotate that. And finally, I've returned to this fractal starfield composite, turned off the bottom black plane, and dragged that into the Nebula Parallax layer and changed the blend mode of the fractal starfield embedded composite to 3D unrolled. This brings the fractal starfield composite in with all of its stars separated into their 3D space. Add some camera animation, and there we have a procedural 3D nebula and starfield in Hitfilm Express. All right, let's look at some ways of creating procedural nebula from scratch. Now, for this section, I'm going to go pretty fast because a lot of this is similar to the way we created land masses in the Creating Planets episode, and most of the other steps are things we've already done in this tutorial. So we're going to go into high speed now and follow along. I've created another comp called Fractal Nebula. I'm going to drag my black plane down. I'm going to go ahead and come up and grab Fractal Noise, drag that to the plane, and I'm just going to tweak around with some settings for a moment. How about swirl? No, I don't like swirl. Yeah, swirl. swirl. Maybe take the scale down. Change the colors. The dark blue. We're just going to adjust this a little bit. I'm going to change the layer properties to add. Grab the freehand mask, and I'm just going to kind of grab a section that I like. Grab another section. Feather everything. Darken that up a bit. Gonna duplicate this. Kill the existing masks. Mask time. And really, the long story short this, I've just created a whole bunch of different black planes that all have different fractal noises on them. I've masked them out, I've pushed them back in 3D space, and I've gone ahead and dragged in the old fractal starfield that we've already built. It's really the exact same thing we just did with the source image, except instead of cutting apart a source image, we created our own fractal noises. There are so many options in fractal noise and so many ways to customize the settings, it's almost pointless to talk about what I did. You may as well just experiment with the fractal noise yourself. And of course, you can combine the methods discussed in this tutorial. Here's a version taking the procedural fractal nebula we just built and dragging in, as an embedded composite shot, the nebula we built with the source photo. I've even dragged in our original fractal star field as an embedded composite shot, combining all three of those into one single 3D composition. Really, just combining a few simple techniques gives you endless possibilities for creation of your own starscapes. I hope you found this tutorial useful. I'm Mike Miller from Tri-M Visual, and I'll see you next time.